In the autumn of 1914, an iron confidence gripped the German Empire. Its armies were a grey tide, sweeping across Belgium and into the heart of France. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's grand blueprint for a swift and total victory, seemed to be unfolding with the precision of a clockwork masterpiece. To the German High Command and the cheering civilians in Berlin, the war was a land war, a contest of armies, and it was a war they were decisively winning. At the heart of Germany's newfound power was its magnificent high seas fleet, a source of immense national pride and the Kaiser's personal obsession. It was a gleaming symbol of Germany's place in the sun. But its purpose was seen as secondary to the army. Its role was to deter the British, perhaps to win a single glorious Trafalgar-style battle in the North Sea. But the real war, the one that mattered, would be won on land long before the Navy's full power was needed. While the world watched the armies clash, a silent, invisible war was beginning on the vast, empty expanses of the ocean. This is the story of that unseen war, a conflict fought not with shells and bayonets, but with ledgers, maritime law, and the quiet, relentless pressure of sea power. To uncover more of the hidden strategic stories that decided history, make sure to subscribe to Blueprint of Battle now. German economic planning was built on one single, overriding assumption: the war would be short. The nation's vast industrial might and its agricultural sector were considered more than sufficient for a conflict lasting a few months. The idea of a long war of economic attrition was dismissed as British fear-mongering. A naval blockade, they believed, was a weapon for a long war, and they were not planning on fighting one. The architect of the German fleet, Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, had built his strategy around risk theory. The German Navy did not need to be bigger than the Royal Navy. It just needed to be powerful enough to pose a significant risk, to inflict enough damage in a single battle that Britain would lose its global naval supremacy. It was a strategy for a single, decisive, and glorious confrontation. This stood in stark contrast to the centuries-old doctrine of the British Royal Navy. Britain's very existence depended on the sea. Its navy was not for a single battle. It was an instrument of global control. Its primary, unspoken purpose in any European war was simple and absolute: to isolate and strangle the enemy through a total naval blockade, cutting them off from the world. The German government placed a great deal of faith in international law, particularly the 1909 Declaration of London. They believed that the principles of freedom of the seas would be upheld. Neutral nations, especially the powerful United States, would never tolerate a British blockade that interfered with their right to trade non-military goods, such as food, with Germany. This was a critical and arrogant miscalculation. Before the war, Germany was a global trading powerhouse, but it was also heavily dependent on imports. It imported over 25% of its food, but the nation's planners were not alarmed. They believed that in a short war, increased domestic production and overland trade with neutral neighbors like the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden would easily cover any shortfall from overseas. The entire German war effort was built on the clock of the Schlieffen Plan. Victory was a matter of weeks. A blockade, by its very nature, is a slow weapon. It takes many months, even years, for its effects to be truly felt. By the time a blockade could begin to bite, German generals confidently assured the Kaiser their soldiers would be parading down the Champs-Élysées. The German public was caught in a wave of patriotic euphoria. The newspapers were filled with glorious reports from the front. The names of distant Belgian towns became household words. The war at sea seemed distant and abstract. The real drama, the destiny of the nation, was being forged by the army in France. The silent pressure building in the North Sea was completely invisible to them. The German naval command, under Admiral von Ingenohl, was cautious. They were under strict orders from the Kaiser not to risk his precious battleships in a major confrontation with the numerically superior British Grand Fleet. This defensive posture played directly into British hands, allowing them to implement their distant blockade without any significant challenge. A few lone voices in Germany saw the danger. The industrialist Walter Rathenau, a man of immense foresight, immediately began organizing a war raw materials department. He understood that a modern industrial war would be a battle of resources, and he knew Germany's reserves were finite. But his was a voice of caution in a chorus of triumphant optimism. The German worldview was fundamentally continental. They saw themselves as a land power, a Macht in der Mitte, power in the middle. Their strategic thinking was dominated by railroads, army corps, and the vast plains of Europe. The sea was, for them, a secondary theatre, a place for prestige and colonial ambition, not a matter of national survival. The British, by contrast, were an oceanic power. Their strategic thinking was global. They understood that the true source of a nation's strength was not just its army, but its economy, its credit, and its access to the world's markets. Their plan was not to defeat the German army in the field, but to bankrupt and starve the German nation into submission. The initial British blockade, declared in late 1914, was technically quite limited. It followed international law and focused on a contraband list of purely military materials. But this was just the opening move in a much larger, more ruthless game. The Germans, seeing this limited action, felt their faith in legal protections was justified. They did not see the noose that was being prepared. German industry was a titan, but it had a hidden vulnerability. It was deeply reliant on imported raw materials like nitrates for explosives, rubber, and copper. The war planners had stockpiled these, but only enough for what they believed would be a short campaign. They had no long-term answer to the problem of being cut off from the world. On the German home front, life in the first few months of the war was remarkably normal. There were patriotic rallies and collections for the war effort, but the shops were full. The harvest of 1914 was good. The feeling was one of confidence and national unity. The idea of food shortages or starvation was unthinkable, a fantasy from a medieval siege. The German high seas fleet remained in its heavily protected bases at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel. It was a fleet in being, a powerful threat that tied down the British Grand Fleet, but it was a passive weapon. It was a caged lion, while the British wolves were silently circling the entire perimeter of their territory. The British strategic position was geographically dominant. The Royal Navy controlled the two exits from the North Sea, the narrow English Channel in the south and the wide gap between northern Scotland and Norway. By mining and patrolling these choke points, they could effectively turn the entire North Sea into a vast prison for the German Navy and its merchant marine. The German public's belief in their own Kultur and economic resilience was absolute. They saw themselves as more organized, more scientific, and more resourceful than the decadent British and French. They believed that German ingenuity, their ersatz, substitute industries, could synthesize or find a replacement for anything the British blockade denied them. The German government launched a massive propaganda campaign to reassure its people. They published charts showing the nation's food reserves and highlighted the trade with neutral neighbors. The message was clear. The British blockade was an annoyance, an illegal act of piracy, but it was not a threat to the German way of life. The core of the German miscalculation was a failure to understand the nature of their opponent. They saw Britain as a nation of merchants who would never risk a costly war that disrupted their own trade. They did not grasp that for Britain, this was an existential struggle for the future of Europe, and they were prepared to use their most powerful weapon, sea power, to its absolute and most ruthless extent. The German Navy's primary offensive weapon was its growing fleet of U-boats. But in 1914, their role was seen as purely military, to sink enemy warships. The idea of using them to wage a counter-blockade against British commerce was not yet a central part of their strategy. It was a weapon whose true, terrible potential was still dormant. In the first winter of the war, the first signs of strain began to appear in Germany, but they were minor. Bread began to be rationed, the K-brot, or war bread, often mixed with potato flour. But this was seen as a patriotic sacrifice, a small inconvenience. No one yet connected it to the silent, invisible pressure being exerted by the ships of the Royal Navy hundreds of miles away. The German fortress seemed secure. The armies were deep inside enemy territory. The home front was united. The high seas fleet was a powerful deterrent, and international law, they believed, protected their access to the vital supplies of a neutral world. From the perspective of Berlin in late 1914, their position was one of immense strength. The arrogance was also legal. German legal scholars wrote lengthy articles denouncing the British blockade as a barbaric violation of international law. They were confident that the world's opinion and the economic power of the neutral nations would force Britain to back down. They were fighting a legal battle while the British were fighting a war of survival. The first Christmas of the war, 1914, was celebrated in Germany with a sense of optimism. The soldiers were not home, as the Kaiser had promised, but victory seemed certain to come in the spring. Families gathered, and while some goods were becoming scarce, the fundamental prosperity of the nation seemed secure. The wolf was at the door, but they could not yet hear it scratching. The British strategy was one of patient, deliberate, and ever-tightening strangulation. They would slowly expand the contraband list, put diplomatic pressure on neutral countries to stop trading with Germany, and use their vast global intelligence network to track every ship heading for a neutral port. It was a slow, bureaucratic, and utterly merciless process. The German people and much of their leadership were looking at a map of Europe and seeing a war of land fronts. The British were looking at a map of the world and seeing a war of global supply chains. This fundamental difference in perspective was the source of Germany's arrogant confidence and Britain's quiet, lethal determination. And so, as 1914 came to a close, the German nation celebrated its military successes, confident that the war would soon be won. They were completely unaware that the real war, a war of hunger, economics, and national survival, had already begun, and that a silent, invisible noose was being slowly, methodically, and relentlessly tightened around their nation's neck. The British solution to the German war machine was not a secret weapon or a brilliant new tactic. It was an ancient, brutal, and deeply controversial strategy, reborn for the industrial age: the naval blockade. To the world, Britain presented itself as a defender of liberal values and the rights of small nations. But in the shadows, its navy was preparing to wield a weapon that would target not the German army, but every man, woman, and child in Germany. This weapon was not a single ship, but a vast, complex, and often invisible system. It was a web of cruisers on distant patrol, of diplomats in neutral capitals, of spies in foreign ports, and of lawyers in London reinterpreting international law. Its power was not in explosive force, but in the quiet, relentless pressure of administrative strangulation. It was a war fought with telegrams and ledgers. In the early days, the blockade was viewed with skepticism, even by some within the British government. It was seen as a slow, passive, and deeply unglorious form of warfare. The public and many naval officers craved a decisive Trafalgar-style fleet action, a glorious clash of dreadnoughts. The idea of a patient economic siege seemed like a dishonorable and cowardly way to fight. The man in charge of this weapon was, at first, an unlikely figure. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was known for his aggressive, offensive spirit. But he and his professional advisors, like the formidable First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher, understood the true nature of British sea power. They knew that Britain's greatest strength was not just in fighting, but in its ability to control the world's oceans. The initial challenge was immense. International law, specifically the Declaration of London, was a major obstacle. It strictly defined contraband as purely military goods and protected the right of neutral countries to trade free goods, such as food and cotton, with any belligerent. A traditional close blockade of German ports was also impossible due to the new threat of mines and submarines. The British solution was an act of audacious legal and geographical reinterpretation. They declared the entire North Sea a military area. Instead of blockading the German coast, they would blockade the entrances to the North Sea itself, hundreds of miles away. They would stop and inspect neutral ships heading for neutral ports in Holland or Scandinavia, operating on the presumption that their cargo was ultimately destined for Germany. This was a radical and legally dubious strategy. It was a distant blockade, a concept that many, including the powerful United States, initially viewed as an illegal infringement on the freedom of the seas. The success of this improbable weapon would depend not just on naval power, but on a high-stakes diplomatic gamble. The human engine of this system was not the swashbuckling naval hero, but the anonymous sailor of the 10th Cruiser Squadron. Known as the Northern Patrol, these men, often older reservists in outdated armed merchant cruisers, endlessly patrolled the brutal, storm-tossed waters between Scotland and Iceland. Their job was grim and monotonous: to intercept and inspect any ship in any weather. These sailors were the unglamorous gatekeepers of the blockade. They faced freezing gales, mountainous seas, and the constant threat of U-boat attack. Their work was not fighting, but the painstaking administrative task of checking manifests and inspecting cargo holds, often in perilous conditions. They were the lonely, frozen face of Britain's most powerful weapon. The British government established a new Ministry of Blockade. It was staffed not by generals, but by economists, lawyers, and trade experts. They created a vast system of blacklists and whitelists, putting immense economic pressure on neutral shipping companies and banks to comply with their restrictions. It was a war of economic coercion, a new form of industrial-age siegecraft. The initial effects were not dramatic. The system was leaky. Germany was able to import vast quantities of goods through neutral neighbors. The Dutch port of Rotterdam, in particular, became a massive loophole, with imports of goods like lard and vegetable oils skyrocketing as they were funneled into Germany. The blockade seemed like an ineffective, bureaucratic mess, but the British were patient. They slowly, methodically, and relentlessly tightened the screws. They used their diplomatic muscle to force neutral countries to accept rationing agreements, limiting their imports to pre-war levels. Every month, another loophole was closed. Another commodity was added to the ever-expanding contraband list. The most controversial and decisive step was the decision to redefine food as conditional contraband. The British argued that in a state of total war, where the German government controlled all food distribution, food was now a strategic weapon used to support the army. Therefore, it could be legally seized. It was a ruthless interpretation that transformed the blockade from a military tool into a weapon against a civilian population. This was the improbable and morally ambiguous heart of the solution. To defeat the German army in the field, Britain had decided it must first break the will of the German people at home. The target was no longer the soldier in the trench, but the farmer, the factory worker, and ultimately the child in the breadline. It was a strategy of total war, taken to its logical, grim conclusion. The Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, under the command of Admiral John Jellicoe, played a crucial, if passive, role. Based at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, their mission was not to seek battle, but to act as the fleet in being that kept the German High Seas Fleet bottled up in its ports. They were the silent, powerful guardians that allowed the distant blockade to operate without interference. Jellicoe famously said he was the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. A decisive defeat of his grand fleet would shatter the blockade and leave Britain exposed. His strategy was one of extreme caution, a source of great frustration for the public, but it was the correct one. The existence of his fleet was more important than its use in a risky battle. The blockade was a double-edged sword. It put immense strain on Britain's relationship with the neutral world, particularly the United States. President Woodrow Wilson's government sent a series of angry diplomatic notes protesting the British infringement on American trading rights. For a time, it seemed the diplomatic cost of the blockade might outweigh its military benefits. This strategy was an underdog, not because it was weak, but because it was slow, unpopular, and went against the dominant military culture of the decisive battle. It required a kind of cold, bureaucratic ruthlessness that was at odds with the romantic, heroic image of warfare. It was a deeply pragmatic and deeply unchivalrous solution. The German U-boat campaign was, in part, a direct response to the blockade. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone and began sinking merchant ships without warning. This was a desperate gamble to counter-strangle Britain. But this very act of aggression, culminating in the sinking of the Lusitania, began to shift American public opinion in Britain's favor. The British system was a marvel of global intelligence. Using their control of the world's undersea telegraph cables, which all routed through Britain, they could intercept commercial telegrams from around the globe. They knew which ships were carrying what cargo and for whom. It was a war of information as much as a war of interception. Even the royal family was part of the effort. King George V renounced his German titles and changed the family name from the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the very English Windsor. This was a powerful symbolic act in the total cultural war against Germany that the blockade represented. The British were fighting a war of attrition, but not the one the Germans understood. The Germans were fighting a war of attrition of soldiers on the battlefield. The British were fighting a war of attrition of nitrates, of rubber, of fats, and of national morale on the home front. It was a deeper, more fundamental, and ultimately more decisive form of attrition. In the early years, the results were hard to see. The German war machine continued to function. The German people, though facing some shortages, were not starving. The skeptics who had called the blockade an ineffective sideshow felt vindicated. The weapon's true, terrible power was accumulating silently, invisibly, beneath the surface of German society. The success of the blockade was not measured in sunken ships, but in the ships that never sailed. It was measured in the American cotton that was never loaded, the Argentine wheat that was never bought, the Chilean nitrates that were never shipped. Its victories were silent, preventative, and written in the ledgers of global commerce. The men of the Northern Patrol were the human face of this relentless pressure. A sailor's diary entry from 1916 reads, "Another week of this. Grey sea, grey sky, grey ship. Stopped a Dutch steamer today. Confiscated her cargo of coffee. The captain cursed us. It's a strange kind of war. We don't see the enemy. We just make his life a little harder, one bag of coffee at a time." This was the strange, improbable, and morally complex weapon that Britain had chosen to wield. It was a strategy that required immense patience, a global reach, and a willingness to target an entire civilian population. It was a silent, suffocating siege on a national scale. The German High Command, focused on the thunder of their guns on the Somme and at Verdun, remained dangerously oblivious to the silent crisis that was slowly enveloping their nation. They saw the shortages at home as a problem of mismanagement, not as the direct result of a deliberate and increasingly effective enemy strategy. The blockade was a long-term investment in victory. It was a bet that Britain's enduring sea power could ultimately outlast Germany's spectacular but fleeting land power. It was a slow, grinding, and deeply unglamorous solution, but it was perfectly suited to the strengths of a global maritime empire. As 1916 dawned, the first serious cracks began to appear in the German home front. The harvest had been poor, the potato crop had failed, and the cumulative effect of the blockade was starting to be felt. The German people, once so confident, were about to be introduced to a new and terrible reality. The silent, invisible weapon, so long underestimated by its creators and ignored by its victims, was now ready to reveal its true, devastating power. The German people, who had cheered their armies on to victory, were about to discover that a new, more insidious front line had been opened, not in the fields of France, but in their own kitchens and on their own dinner tables. The winter of 1916 arrived in Germany with a chilling, unnatural quiet. The patriotic fervor of the war's early years had faded, replaced by a weary stoicism. But as the leaves fell, a new and unfamiliar enemy began to stalk the streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. It was an enemy that the German army, for all its power, could not fight. It was the specter of hunger. The turning point was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, creeping and horrifying realization. The harvest of 1916 had been a disaster. Unusually cold and wet weather had decimated the grain supply. But more catastrophically, the potato crop, the staple food of the German working class, had failed due to a rampant blight. The nation's primary source of calories had vanished. This domestic crisis collided with the now brutally effective British blockade. The neutral countries, under immense British diplomatic and economic pressure, had drastically reduced their food exports to Germany. The small streams of imported food that had once supplemented the German diet had been reduced to a mere trickle. The nation was now an island, completely isolated from the world's food supply. The German government was forced to introduce a new staple food to replace the potato. It was the humble and universally despised turnip. The winter of 1916-1917 would forever be seared into the German collective memory as the Reuben Winter, the Turnip Winter. It was a period of profound misery, and the moment the war came home with a vengeance. For the German civilian, life became a grim daily obsession with food. Turnips were served for every meal, in every conceivable form: turnip bread, turnip soup, turnip sausages, even turnip coffee. The vegetable, once used primarily as animal fodder, became the taste of national suffering. Its bland, earthy flavor, a constant reminder of their isolation and hunger. This was the shocking turning point. The war was no longer a distant, heroic struggle reported in the newspapers. It was a gnawing emptiness in the stomach, the cry of a hungry child, the endless, dispiriting queue for a loaf of bread made mostly of sawdust and turnip flour. The silent, invisible British weapon had finally made its presence felt in the most visceral way imaginable. A German housewife's diary entry from Berlin in January 1917 captures the despair. "Another day, another turnip. The children weep. They say they cannot eat it anymore. My husband writes from the front of the French soldiers they have captured, who are fat and well-fed. How can this be? We were told we were winning." The physical effects were devastating. Malnutrition became rampant. Diseases related to vitamin deficiency, like scurvy and rickets, which had been eradicated for decades, suddenly reappeared. The average daily caloric intake for a civilian dropped to around 1,000 calories, less than half of what was required for a healthy life. The nation was slowly, systematically being starved. The shock was profound because it was a direct contradiction of the government's entire narrative. For 2 years, the German people had been told of their nation's strength, its resourcefulness, its inevitable victory. Now they were confronted with a shocking reality. Their powerful, modern, scientific state could not even provide them with a loaf of bread. The social fabric of the nation began to tear. A black market for food flourished, creating bitter resentment between those with money and the starving masses. Farmers were accused of hoarding food, and hamstring expeditions into the countryside by desperate city dwellers often ended in violence. The national unity, the Burgfrieden of 1914, was collapsing into a bitter struggle of all against all. This was the true, shocking power of the blockade. It did not just deny resources to the German war machine. It atomized German society. It turned neighbor against neighbor, city against countryside. It eroded the very foundations of trust and solidarity upon which the national war effort was built. For the soldiers on leave, returning from the front, the shock was immense. They left a world of industrial slaughter, but also one of regular, if monotonous, rations. They returned to a home front of gaunt faces, listless children, and a pervasive sour smell of turnips. Many soldiers reported that the morale in the breadlines of Berlin was lower than in the trenches of Verdun. The German government's response was a massive and ultimately futile bureaucratic effort. They introduced a complex system of rationing for every conceivable item. But there was little to ration. The state was now in the business of managing scarcity, not providing for its people. The famous German gift for organization was now being used to organize hunger. The Turnip Winter was a quiet, domestic cataclysm. An estimated 400,000 to 750,000 German civilians would die from malnutrition and starvation-related diseases during the war, the vast majority of them during and after this terrible winter. This was a casualty figure on the scale of a major military campaign, but the victims were the old, the sick, and the very young. This was the enemy's admission, written not in a general's report, but on the gaunt, hollowed-out faces of the German people. The British weapon, so long derided as ineffective and illegal, was proving to be the most devastatingly effective weapon of the entire war. It was a weapon that bypassed the army and struck directly at the nation's heart. The German High Command, led by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, was now faced with a terrifying new reality. The home front was no longer a stable, supportive base. It was becoming a second front, a front of social unrest and collapsing morale. The very will of the German people to continue the war was beginning to crumble. The shock was amplified by the enemy's apparent abundance. Captured British soldiers were found to have pockets full of chocolate and tobacco. Their rations were luxurious by German standards. This created a powerful and demoralizing myth of an enemy with infinite resources, an enemy who could not be beaten in a war of attrition. The women of Germany bore the heaviest burden. They were the ones who had to manage the household on vanishing resources, who had to stand for hours in the freezing cold of the breadlines, and who had to face the impossible task of explaining to their children why there was no more food. Their suffering was the silent engine of the nation's collapse. The Turnip Winter was a turning point because it revealed the fundamental lie at the heart of the German war effort. The government had promised a quick, heroic victory. Instead, it had delivered a long, grinding war of misery and starvation. The credibility of the Kaiser's regime was shattered, a blow from which it would never recover. The invisible war had finally become visible. The German people, who had been looking at maps of their armies deep in France and Russia, were now forced to confront the map of their own hunger. The distant, abstract naval war was now a concrete, agonizing reality in their own homes. The social and political consequences were explosive. Food riots, once unthinkable in the disciplined German state, became increasingly common. The first major worker strikes began to break out in the munitions factories, a direct challenge to the authority of the military government. The silent weapon of the blockade was giving a loud voice to social dissent. The German government's desperate response was to intensify the U-boat campaign. In February 1917, they declared unrestricted submarine warfare, a final desperate gamble to starve Britain before Britain could starve them. This was a direct admission that the blockade was working and that they were losing the war of attrition. This very act of desperation, however, would prove to be Germany's undoing. The sinking of neutral, and particularly American ships, would be the final provocation that would, just a few months later, draw the immense industrial and manpower resources of the United States into the war on the Allied side, sealing Germany's fate. A German doctor, Alfred Grotjahn, wrote of the period, "It was a descent into a new kind of barbarism. The war was no longer something happening out there. It was inside our homes, inside our bodies. We were a nation that was slowly, inexorably eating itself." The shock was also intellectual. The German scientific community, which had prided itself on its ability to create ersatz, substitute materials for everything from rubber to nitrates, was confronted by a problem it could not solve: the synthesis of food. They could create explosives from the air, but they could not create calories. This was the hellish warfare that the British had unleashed. It was a war fought not with glorious charges, but with the cold, patient and bureaucratic turning of a screw, a gradual tightening of a noose that was now choking the life out of an entire nation. The Turnip Winter was the moment of truth. It was the point at which the German people and their leaders were forced to confront the reality that their pre-war arrogance had been a fatal delusion. They were not a self-sufficient continental power. They were a nation deeply dependent on a global system that their enemy now controlled. The children born during these years were a lost generation. They grew up stunted, both physically and mentally, by the chronic malnutrition of the war years. The long-term health consequences of the blockade would haunt Germany for decades after the armistice. The weapons' effects were generational. The quiet, monotonous work of the sailors of the Northern Patrol, endlessly circling in the freezing grey of the North Atlantic, was now revealed for what it was: the most decisive, single campaign of the entire war. They had been the gatekeepers of Germany's hunger, the architects of its eventual collapse. The German nation was now trapped. Their armies were still powerful, their soldiers still brave. But the nation's will was being systematically destroyed from within. But how did this silent, bureaucratic weapon actually work? What was the vast hidden machinery that allowed the British to police the world's oceans and decide who could and could not eat? The British naval blockade was a masterpiece of strategic strangulation, a war won not by cannonades, but by control. Its genius lay in its geography. Britain was a giant, unsinkable aircraft carrier, perfectly positioned to act as the cork in Germany's bottle. By controlling the two exits from the North Sea, the narrow English Channel and the vast gap between Scotland and Norway, the Royal Navy could turn an entire sea into a prison. The workhorse of this system was the 10th Cruiser Squadron, the Northern Patrol. It was a motley fleet of armed merchant cruisers, often aging passenger liners hastily fitted with guns. These ships were slow and vulnerable, but they were numerous. Their mission was not to fight, but to relentlessly patrol the brutal, storm-tossed waters of the North Atlantic, the lonely gatekeepers of Germany's economy. In the south, the Dover Patrol sealed the English Channel with a formidable combination of minefields, steel anti-submarine nets, and a constant patrol of destroyers. This closed the back door. Any ship seeking to trade with Germany was now forced to take the long northern route directly into the waiting arms of the Northern Patrol. There was no escape. The legal strategy was as audacious as the naval one. Britain unilaterally abandoned the restrictive Declaration of London and began to systematically rewrite the rules of maritime warfare. They massively expanded the definition of contraband to include not just weapons, but almost any material, cotton, rubber, chemicals that could conceivably be used by the enemy's war industry. The most crucial and ruthless innovation was the doctrine of continuous voyage. The British argued that even if a neutral ship was sailing to a neutral port like Rotterdam or Copenhagen, its cargo could be seized if Britain suspected its ultimate destination was Germany. This gave them the legal justification to interfere with almost all trade in Northern Europe. This entire economic war was orchestrated by the newly created Ministry of Blockade. It was a weaponized bureaucracy, staffed by economists and lawyers. They created a global blacklist of any neutral company suspected of trading with Germany. Any firm on this list was cut off from the British Empire's vast financial and commercial system, a death sentence for most businesses. The numbers tell the story of this slow, administrative strangulation. Before the war, Germany imported millions of tons of goods by sea. By 1917, that number had been reduced by over 80%. Key industrial materials, essential for a modern war, were reduced to a trickle. Imports of nitrates, vital for both explosives and fertilizer, fell by 98%. The industrial giant was being starved of its fuel. The blockade was a high-stakes diplomatic poker game, and the main player was the United States. Every seizure of an American ship or cargo brought a furious diplomatic protest from Washington. For 2 years, Britain had to walk a tightrope, tightening the blockade enough to hurt Germany, but not so much as to provoke the powerful United States into a hostile reaction. The silent guardian of the whole system was the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet. Hidden away at its remote base in Scapa Flow, Admiral Jellicoe's armada of super dreadnoughts was the fleet in being. Its very existence kept the German high seas fleet trapped in port, preventing it from ever challenging the cruisers and destroyers that were enforcing the blockade. It won the war by not fighting. Intelligence was the nervous system of the blockade. The famous Room 40, the Admiralty's code-breaking unit, had cracked the German diplomatic and naval codes. By intercepting telegrams, they could often learn the true nature and destination of a ship's cargo before it even left port, guiding the patrols of the Northern Patrol with uncanny precision. The blockade evolved. What began as a traditional military blockade became a total economic war. The British government began to buy up entire global supplies of key commodities, like the whole Norwegian fish catch, not because they needed it, but simply to deny it to Germany. It was a war fought on the commodity exchanges of London and New York. This was a new form of industrial age siegecraft. In the past, armies had surrounded a single city to starve it out. The Royal Navy, with its global reach, had placed an entire industrial nation of 67 million people under siege. The scale was unprecedented, a chilling application of modern logistics and administration to an ancient, brutal strategy. The strategy was brilliant in its efficiency. It attacked Germany at its weakest point, its dependence on the global maritime system that Britain controlled. While Germany was a continental land power, its industrial and economic health was inextricably linked to the sea. The British had correctly identified this Achilles' heel. The effect on Germany's agriculture was catastrophic. The blockade cut off the import of nitrates for fertilizer, and, equally importantly, the animal feed needed to sustain the nation's livestock. This led to a mass slaughter of pigs in 1915, the infamous Schweinemord, which destroyed the nation's primary source of fat and created a critical food shortage that would only worsen. The blockade's power was its relentless cumulative effect. Each intercepted cargo, each blacklisted company, was a small, almost insignificant blow. But thousands of these small blows, delivered consistently over years, created a crushing, inexorable pressure that slowly ground down the entire German war economy and the morale of its people. The British government skillfully used propaganda to justify its actions to the world. They portrayed the blockade as a clean, humane form of warfare, a pressure applied to the German government to shorten the war. They carefully omitted the fact that its primary victims were not soldiers or politicians, but civilians, particularly women and children. The Germans, for their part, had no effective answer. Their high seas fleet was unwilling to risk a decisive battle. Their surface raiders were quickly hunted down. Their only weapon capable of striking back at the British system was the U-boat, and the decision to unleash it in an unrestricted campaign against civilian shipping would ultimately prove to be a fatal, self-inflicted wound. The strategic genius was in its flexibility. As the Germans found new ways to circumvent the blockade through smuggling or developing ersatz materials, the British adapted. The Ministry of Blockade was a learning organization, constantly refining its methods, closing loopholes, and applying pressure in new and unexpected ways. The blockade was also a war of information. The British censored all mail and telegrams passing through their territory. This gave them an unparalleled insight into the German economy and allowed them to build a detailed picture of which neutral companies were secretly working for the enemy. Knowledge in this war was truly power. This weapon was not just about denial, it was about control. Britain used its power over the world's shipping, insurance, and coaling stations to compel neutral nations to comply. A neutral ship that refused to be inspected could find itself unable to buy coal or secure insurance anywhere in the world. The economic pressure was immense. The blockade's success was not inevitable. It was a calculated risk that depended on the professionalism of the Royal Navy, the skill of its diplomats, and the immense financial strength of the British Empire. It was a testament to the unique strengths of a global maritime superpower. The ultimate strategic avalanche was the slow, grinding collapse of the German home front. The Turnip Winter was not a natural disaster. It was the direct, calculated result of this multi-year campaign of economic strangulation. The British had successfully turned food into a weapon of mass destruction. The sheer administrative scale of the operation was a new phenomenon. It was a war fought by thousands of clerks in London, tracking manifests and compiling lists. It was the birth of modern economic warfare, a conflict where the accountant's ledger could be as mighty as the battleship's gun. The Germans' faith in international law had been a fatal delusion. The British, in what they saw as a war for national survival, simply tore up the rulebook. They demonstrated that in a total war, legal arguments are meaningless when confronted with the cold, hard reality of overwhelming sea power. This was a war of systems. The Germans had created a perfect military system for winning a short land war. The British had perfected a global economic system for winning a long attritional war. The First World War was the Titanic, an ultimately one-sided collision between these two fundamentally different systems. The blockade also had a profound effect on the war's outcome by crippling German arms production. The lack of imported materials like copper, rubber, and nickel created severe bottlenecks in the production of shells, aircraft, and vehicles. A hidden attrition that weakened the German army in the field every single day. The strategic dive reveals a weapon that was both brilliant and barbaric. It was a way to win the war with fewer casualties on the battlefield, but it did so by shifting the suffering to the most vulnerable members of the enemy's society. It was a cold, logical, and deeply uncomfortable form of warfare. The German U-boat campaign, the desperate response to the blockade, was a strategic gift to the British. Every neutral ship it sank created another enemy for Germany and pushed neutral opinion, especially in America, further towards the Allied cause. The blockade had goaded Germany into a fatal act of self-destruction. This was the hidden blueprint of British victory. While the world focused on the mud and blood of the trenches, the true decisive battle was being fought silently, invisibly, by the grey ships in the North Sea, and the quiet clerks in Whitehall. It was the ultimate flanking maneuver, an attack on the entire foundation of the German state. We have now analyzed the vast, intricate and ruthless machine of the British blockade. We have seen how geography, law and economics were forged into a weapon of total war. But what was the lived reality of this strategy? What did it feel like to be a German civilian on the receiving end of this slow, inexorable starvation? The British blockade was a grand strategy, a game of empires played on a global map, but its consequences were felt not in the halls of power, but in the kitchens, the factories, and the bodies of ordinary German civilians. The human engine of this story is not one of courage in battle, but of quiet, grinding, and desperate endurance on the home front, the Heimat front. At the heart of this struggle was the German Hausfrau, the housewife. She was the unwilling general in this new domestic war. Her battlefield was the marketplace, her enemies were scarcity and inflation, and her daily mission was the impossible task of creating a meal out of almost nothing. Her entire existence became a relentless, exhausting quest for calories. The day began before dawn, standing for hours in a queue, a polonaise, in the freezing cold. It was a line for bread, for a few potatoes, for a sliver of meat if one was lucky. Often, after hours of waiting, the supplies would run out, and the women would have to return home empty-handed to face their hungry children. This daily ritual of hope and disappointment became the defining experience of the war. The food itself was a testament to desperate ingenuity. The K-brot, or war bread, became infamous. It was a dense, dark loaf, composed of a little rye flour stretched with whatever was available, potato flour, turnip flour, and eventually sawdust and chalk. It was barely edible, a constant physical reminder of the nation's decline. A young German schoolgirl, Agnes Bartscherer, kept a diary. Her entries are a poignant record of a childhood consumed by hunger. For dinner, turnip soup. For lunch, turnip cutlets. For breakfast, turnip marmalade on sawdust bread. I've forgotten the taste of real food. I dream of an apple, just one apple. The children of the Turnip Winter were its most tragic victims. Malnutrition stunted their growth and weakened their immune systems. They were a generation of pale, listless children, too weak to play, their eyes large in their gaunt faces. The laughter in the schoolyards faded, replaced by a quiet, gnawing hunger. Rickets, a disease of malnutrition that causes bone deformities, became epidemic. The social contract began to dissolve under the pressure of hunger. The cherished German values of order, community, and respect for the law evaporated. The black market, the Schleichhandel, became the true economy. Those with money or connections could find food, while the poor and the honest starved. It created a deep and lasting bitterness that poisoned German society. Desperate city dwellers would embark on Hamsterfahrten, or hamstering trips, into the countryside. They would travel by train to rural areas, hoping to trade their precious belongings, a wedding ring, a silver watch, directly with farmers for a bag of potatoes or a side of bacon. These trips were illegal and often ended in conflict with the police or hostile villagers. The human body itself became a battleground. As the blockade tightened, the lack of fats was particularly severe. This led to a range of health problems, from skin diseases to a decreased ability to absorb vitamins. The German people were not just hungry. They were suffering from a collective national malnutrition that made them susceptible to every kind of illness. For the factory workers, the situation was dire. They were expected to work 12-hour shifts in the munitions factories, producing the weapons for a total war, but they were doing so on a starvation diet. Their productivity plummeted. Illness and absenteeism became rampant. The industrial heart of the German war machine was slowly seizing up from a lack of fuel. The psychological toll was immense. Hunger created a constant, low-level anxiety and irritability. Fights broke out in the food queues. Families disintegrated under the strain. The German people, once so disciplined and united, were becoming a nation of hungry, desperate individuals. The blockade was an attack on their very character. The women of Germany were the shock absorbers of this entire crisis. They were the ones who performed the double burden, working long hours in the factories to replace the men at the front, and then spending the rest of their waking hours engaged in the desperate, all-consuming hunt for food. Their resilience was the only thing holding German society together. The contrast between the front and the home front was surreal. A soldier on leave would return to a world he no longer recognized. He would find his wife aged and gaunt, his children thin and listless. This created a profound sense of guilt and anger. Many soldiers felt that the civilians at home were suffering more than they were in the trenches. The German government's propaganda machine worked overtime to manage this crisis. They promoted recipes for turnip dishes, praised the virtues of patriotic sacrifice, and blamed the entire situation on the barbaric and illegal British hunger blockade. But propaganda was not edible. It could not fill an empty stomach. The human engine of the blockade was the sailor of the Northern Patrol. His life was one of brutal monotony and extreme danger. For weeks on end, he would see nothing but the grey, storm-tossed waves of the North Atlantic. His enemy was the weather as much as the U-boats. He was the lonely agent of his nation's silent, deadly strategy. These sailors were often older men, reservists pulled from the merchant navy. They were not elite warriors, but they were superb seamen. Their ability to navigate and survive in the world's most hostile waters was the fundamental skill that made the blockade possible. They were the quiet, forgotten heroes of Britain's war. Their work was painstaking. Boarding a neutral ship in a heaving Atlantic swell was incredibly dangerous. The boarding parties, often led by a young lieutenant, had to be diplomats, detectives, and soldiers all at once. They had to be firm but fair, knowing that a single mistake could create a major diplomatic incident. The human drama was not just in Germany. In neutral ports like Rotterdam, a different struggle was taking place. Merchants, spies, and diplomats engaged in a complex shadow war. The British tried to track every shipment, while German agents used 1,000 tricks, false manifests, dummy corporations, to try and smuggle vital goods past the ever-watchful eyes of the blockade. The blockade created a generation of German doctors who had to become experts in the diseases of malnutrition. They documented the horrific effects of the Kriegsernährung, war diet, on the civilian population, creating a grim scientific record of the human cost of Britain's economic war. The suffering was not evenly distributed. The urban working class and the lower middle class were hit the hardest. The wealthy could always find food on the black market, and the rural farmers could subsist on what they grew. This created deep class divisions and a sense of profound injustice that would have lasting political consequences after the war. The blockade was an attack on the future. The infant mortality rate in Germany skyrocketed. Children who survived the war were often physically and mentally stunted for life. The British weapon was not just killing Germans in 1917, it was killing and maiming the Germans of the 1930s and 40s. Its effects were insidious and long-lasting. In this environment, any small luxury became a symbol of unimaginable wealth. An orange, a piece of real chocolate, or a coffee bean was a treasure, a reminder of a lost world of abundance. These small things became the focus of intense desire and envy. The human engine of this story is, ultimately, a tale of two home fronts. The British home front, though facing its own shortages and the terror of the U-boat campaign, was, by comparison, a land of plenty. This vast and growing disparity in living standards was the true measure of the blockade's success. The German sense of betrayal was profound. They felt they had been abandoned by the world and were being subjected to a uniquely cruel and illegal form of warfare. This sense of victimhood, of a nation unjustly starved, would become a powerful and dangerous element in post-war German politics. The spirit of scientific innovation was also part of this human story. German chemists, led by figures like Fritz Haber, worked miracles. They developed a process to synthesize nitrates from the air, the Haber-Bosch process, which allowed Germany to produce explosives even when cut off from Chilean saltpeter. But they could not synthesize food. The blockade was a war on mothers. It turned the fundamental act of nurturing a child into a daily struggle of impossible choices. Do you give the last piece of bread to your oldest, who has to work, or your youngest, who is fading away? It was a form of psychological torture on a national scale. The story of the blockade is the story of the quiet, invisible collapse of a modern industrial society. It was not a dramatic, explosive collapse like a battlefield defeat. It was a slow, internal rotting, a gradual decay of the very bonds of trust, health, and hope that hold a nation together. The men who endured this, the German civilians, were not soldiers, but they displayed a unique kind of courage, the courage of endurance. It was the grim, stoic courage of the queue, of the turnip soup, of simply getting up each morning to face another day of gnawing, inescapable hunger. The British sailors of the blockade were also enduring. They were fighting a war of immense boredom, punctuated by moments of extreme terror. But they understood their mission. They were the wall. They were the reason that back home, their own families had enough to eat. This simple, powerful motivation kept them going in the face of the gales and the U-boats. And so, the human engine of the blockade was a vast and complex machine of suffering and endurance. It was a story of two peoples, one slowly starving, the other methodically turning the screw. But what was the final admission from the German leadership? How did the proud generals and the Kaiser himself finally come to terms with the fact that their military might was being undone by this silent, invisible weapon? For much of the war, the German High Command existed in a state of strategic denial. The generals, focused on their maps and the movements of armies, viewed the growing crisis on the home front as a civilian problem, a matter of poor organization and a lack of patriotic spirit. To men like Erich Ludendorff, the solution was simple: more discipline, more control, and more work from the civilian population. The first, grudging admissions were not words, but actions. In 1916, Ludendorff and Hindenburg effectively seized control of the state, creating a military dictatorship known as the Silent Dictatorship. Their Hindenburg program was a massive top-down reorganization of the German economy for total war. It was a tacit admission that the civilian government had failed and that the nation was in crisis. The architects of this new total war economy, however, still failed to grasp the true nature of their enemy. They could mobilize every man and woman, every factory and farm, but they could not create resources out of thin air. Their entire plan was predicated on a level of national self-sufficiency that, thanks to the blockade, simply no longer existed. The most dramatic and fatal admission came in early 1917. Faced with the horror of the Turnip Winter and the collapse of morale, the German High Command made a desperate, world-altering gamble. They authorized the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, a campaign to sink any and all ships heading to Britain. This was a direct, public admission that they were losing the war of attrition and needed to counter-strangle Britain into submission. Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, Chief of the Naval Staff, famously promised the Kaiser, "I give your Majesty my word as an officer that not one American will land on the continent." This was the ultimate gamble. They were so desperate to break the blockade's grip that they were willing to risk bringing the immense power of the United States into the war against them. This decision was the loudest, most desperate scream for help from the German leadership. It was a confession that the silent British weapon was winning. The U-boat campaign was not a sign of strength, but the last convulsive act of a slowly suffocating giant lashing out at its tormentor in a desperate bid for air. In his post-war memoirs, Ludendorff would be more explicit. He wrote of the home front. The effects of the blockade were becoming ever more serious. The spirit of the army was being systematically undermined by the accounts of suffering which the men received from home. It was a clear admission that the war was being lost, not in the trenches, but in the breadlines. The German government's own official reports, though heavily censored, told a story of quiet desperation. A secret report to the Reichstag in 1917 stated, "The physical condition of the working class has deteriorated to a catastrophic degree. The continuation of the war effort is now seriously threatened by the collapse of the home front." The admission was also written in the changing diet of the German soldier. By 1918, the rations for the men at the front had been cut drastically. The well-fed, confident soldier of 1914 had been replaced by a hungry, weary man who was often in no better physical condition than the civilians he was supposed to be defending. The blockade had finally reached the front line. The failure of the Great German Spring Offensive in 1918 was the final military proof of the blockade's success. The German armies, using new stormtrooper tactics, achieved a massive breakthrough. But they could not sustain their advance. They had run out of resources, out of supplies, and out of physically fit men. The offensive literally ran out of steam. A German officer described the moment his men broke through to the Allied rear areas. They did not push on, they stopped. They fell upon the enemy's supply dumps like wolves. They had found food and white bread. It was a sight I shall never forget. In that moment, I knew the war was lost. It was a defeat by a loaf of bread. The German leadership was forced to admit that the blockade had also attrited their industrial base. The lack of rubber for tires, of copper for shell casings, of tungsten for steel, had created a qualitative decline in their military equipment. Their war machine, once the world's finest, was literally falling apart. Even the Kaiser's rhetoric changed. The confident, bombastic speeches of 1914 were replaced by defensive, almost pleading calls for national unity and endurance. He was no longer leading a triumphant nation. He was begging a starving one to hold on just a little longer. The ultimate admission came in the autumn of 1918. It was not the Allied armies, which had not yet entered Germany, that brought the end. It was the German Navy. The sailors of the High Seas Fleet, ordered to set out on a final suicidal death ride against the Royal Navy, mutinied. Their reasons were simple. They were starving, and they were not willing to die for a lost cause. This mutiny at Kiel was the spark that lit the German Revolution. The collapse of the war effort was not a military event. It was a social and political implosion, triggered by years of hunger, misery, and a profound loss of faith in the leadership. The blockade had not just defeated Germany, it had dissolved it. In his final, desperate appeal to President Woodrow Wilson for an armistice, the German Chancellor Max von Baden explicitly cited the imminent starvation of the German people as a primary reason for seeking peace. It was a formal diplomatic admission of the blockade's triumph. After the war, a German parliamentary committee was set up to investigate the causes of the defeat. Their conclusions were stark. The final report stated unequivocally that the British naval blockade was the single most decisive factor in Germany's collapse. The hunger blockade, they wrote, had paralyzed the German people's will to resist. The German public, who had been fed a diet of propaganda and promises of victory for 4 years, was left in a state of profound shock and betrayal. They had not been told the truth about the severity of the blockade. This led to the powerful and dangerous stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that the army had not been defeated in the field, but had been betrayed by a collapse at home. A German doctor, writing after the armistice, offered a grim medical assessment. "We were not defeated by the genius of Foch or the numbers of the Americans. We were defeated by general starvation. He was the enemy we could not fight. He was inside our homes, in our hospitals, and in our children's bodies." The admission from the enemy was not just in their words, but in their post-war actions. The leaders of the new German Republic, and later the Nazi regime, would be obsessed with the concept of autarky, or national self-sufficiency. They were determined that Germany would never again be vulnerable to a naval blockade. The trauma had become national policy. The British themselves, though victorious, were sobered by the power of the weapon they had wielded. The quiet, administrative act of strangling a nation from afar was a form of warfare so total and so devastating that it left many of its architects with a deep sense of moral ambiguity. A high-ranking German industrialist, captured at the end of the war, explained it in simple economic terms. "You did not need to defeat our army. You just had to wait. You controlled the world's resources. We had only the resources of Central Europe." The war was a mathematical certainty from the moment it became a long war. The German generals, in their memoirs, would often focus on their tactical victories on the battlefield. But between the lines, they could not escape the ultimate damning reality. Hindenburg himself admitted that the home front, weakened by English propaganda and the effects of the blockade, had failed the army. The most powerful admission was the physical state of the German people at the war's end. When Allied relief missions finally entered Germany, they were shocked by the widespread evidence of malnutrition, the gaunt children, and the prevalence of disease. The physical evidence of the blockade's success was written on the bodies of the German population. The German High Command's arrogance in 1914 was based on their belief that they could control the rules of the game. They would fight a land war where they were strongest. The British, in their quiet, ruthless way, simply refused to play that game. They changed the game to one of global economics, a game Germany was destined to lose. The final tragic irony for the German people was that the blockade did not end with the armistice. The British maintained it for several more months until the Treaty of Versailles was signed to ensure Germany's compliance. The suffering continued even after the guns had fallen silent. The German nation had been confronted with a new form of total warfare, one that erased the distinction between soldier and civilian. The British had turned an entire nation into a besieged fortress and had simply waited for it to starve. It was a chillingly modern and brutally effective strategy. The German war machine, the most powerful army in the world, had not been broken in a decisive battle. It had simply withered away, its roots cut off by an invisible, relentless enemy. It was a defeat by 1,000 small cuts, a death by economic strangulation. The quiet sailors of the Northern Patrol and the anonymous clerks in the Ministry of Blockade had been the architects of this victory. They had defeated the heirs of Bismarck and Moltke, not with heroism in battle, but with the patient, methodical, and soul-crushing application of administrative power. And so, the masters of the German Empire had been forced to admit defeat, brought to their knees by a weapon they had once dismissed as illegal, immoral, and ineffective. But what would be the lasting legacy of this terrible new form of warfare? How would the hunger blockade shape the violent history of the century to come? The guns fell silent in November 1918, but the hunger did not. The British naval blockade, The silent weapon that had brought the German Empire to its knees was maintained for months after the armistice, a brutal insurance policy to ensure Germany's compliance with the terms of peace. This final act of cruelty left a deep and lasting scar on the German psyche, a poison that would shape the violent history of the decades to come. The most immediate and dangerous legacy was the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. The German army had not been defeated in the field, it had been betrayed by a collapse at home. This powerful, self-serving lie was embraced by nationalists and the military elite. The blockade, by making the collapse of the home front so real and so painful, became the primary evidence for this myth, diverting blame from the generals and onto civilians, politicians, and minorities. A young, decorated corporal, recovering from a gas attack, heard the news of the armistice with burning fury. His name was Adolf Hitler. For him, and for many like him, the story of the blockade was not a story of a brilliant enemy strategy, but of a national humiliation, a lesson in the vulnerability of a nation dependent on others. This lesson would become the dark heart of his own murderous ideology. The Nazi obsession with Lebensraum, or living space, was the direct monstrous child of the Turnip Winter. Hitler was determined that Germany would never again be held hostage by a naval power. His goal was to conquer the vast agricultural lands of Eastern Europe, to create a self-sufficient continental empire that could withstand any blockade. The hunger of 1917 became the blueprint for the slaughter of 1941. The naval blockade of Germany perfected the grim science of economic warfare. It became the model for all subsequent sanctions regimes. The use of financial blacklists, the control of global commodities, and the application of diplomatic pressure to enforce an economic siege are all tactics that were pioneered by the British Ministry of Blockade and are still central to global power politics today. The blockade left a profound and troubling moral legacy. It erased the already blurring line between combatant and civilian, turning an entire population into a legitimate military target. The ethical questions raised by the hunger blockade, is it justifiable to starve civilians to shorten a war? Are questions that continue to haunt modern conflicts and the application of economic sanctions. In Britain, the legacy was one of quiet, almost embarrassed triumph. The heroes of the blockade were the anonymous sailors and the faceless clerks. There were no glorious cavalry charges or dramatic battles to celebrate. The victory had been achieved through a slow, bureaucratic, and morally ambiguous process. As a result, its central role in winning the war has often been downplayed in popular history, overshadowed by the mud and blood of the trenches. The strategy had a lasting impact on international law. In the aftermath of the war, there were attempts to strengthen the laws of the sea to prevent such a total blockade from ever happening again. But the lesson that had been truly learned by the world's great powers was a more cynical one. In a total war for national survival, legal arguments are ultimately meaningless in the face of overwhelming power. The men of the Northern Patrol, the quiet heroes of the blockade, returned to a world that barely recognized their contribution. Their war had been one of monotonous endurance in the freezing gales of the North Atlantic. There were no victory parades for the men who had spent 4 years checking cargo manifests. Theirs was a silent victory, and they remained silent heroes. The blockade was a testament to the unique, global nature of British power in the early 20th century. Only a nation that controlled the world's oceans, its telegraph cables, its coaling stations, and its financial systems could have conceived of and executed such a vast and complex strategy. It was the final, terrible flourish of a fading maritime empire. The experience of the blockade deeply scarred a generation of German scientists and industrialists. The post-war obsession with autarky led to groundbreaking research in the development of synthetic materials. The creation of synthetic rubber, Buna, and synthetic fuel from coal were direct results of the trauma of being cut off from the world's natural resources. The German High Seas Fleet, the pride of the Kaiser, ended its war in the most humiliating way imaginable. Having mutinied, it sailed not into a glorious final battle, but into internment at the British naval base of Scapa Flow. There, in a final defiant act of nihilism, the German sailors scuttled their own ships, sending the entire fleet to the bottom of the sea. It was a fittingly bleak end for a navy that had lost a war it had barely fought. The blockade demonstrated a new and terrible vulnerability of the modern, interconnected world. It proved that a nation's greatest strength, its complex industrial economy, could also be its greatest weakness. The intricate web of global trade that created prosperity in peacetime could be transformed into a weapon of strangulation in wartime. The story of the blockade is a story of two different kinds of power. The Germans wielded the spectacular, explosive power of a modern army. The British wielded the quiet, systemic power of a global economic network. In the end, the slow, grinding pressure of the system proved more decisive than the explosive power of the army. The tragedy is that the blockade's very success helped to lay the groundwork for an even more terrible conflict. The bitterness and sense of national humiliation it engendered in Germany became fertile soil for the extremist politics of the 1920s and 30s. The weapon that won the Great War also helped to sow the seeds of the Second World War. Today, economic sanctions are a primary tool of international diplomacy. The tactics are more sophisticated, the targets more precise, but the fundamental principle is the same as the one ruthlessly applied by the Ministry of Blockade over a century ago: to inflict economic pain in order to compel a change in political behavior. The physical legacy of the blockade is invisible. There are no craters, no cemeteries, no ruined fortresses. Its scars are written not on the landscape, but in the demographic and psychological history of the German people. It was a weapon whose damage was internal, institutional, and generational. The story serves as a chilling reminder that the most powerful weapon is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. The thunder of the great guns at Verdun was deafening, but the silent scratching of pens in the ledgers of the Ministry of Blockade and the quiet thrum of a cruiser's engine in a North Atlantic gale were, in the end, far more decisive. The German generals, who had laughed at the idea of a long war in 1914, had been proven catastrophically wrong. They had prepared for a chess game of tactical brilliance on a single board, and had not realized they were engaged in a global contest of resources where their opponent owned the entire factory that produced the pieces. The final, bitter irony for Germany was that even in defeat, the hunger did not end. The continuation of the blockade after the armistice was seen as a profound betrayal of the terms of peace and a national humiliation that would never be forgiven. It was a final turn of the screw that ensured a legacy of resentment. The legacy of the blockade is a profound and uncomfortable one. It forces us to confront the nature of total war and to ask difficult questions about the moral lines that are and are not drawn when a nation's survival is at stake. It is a story with no simple heroes, only the grim logic of attrition. The British Royal Navy had won its most decisive victory since Trafalgar, but it had done so without a single, glorious fleet action. It was a victory of spreadsheets over broadsides, of patience over passion. It was a modern bureaucratic victory for a modern bureaucratic age. The German people's faith in their government and their military was shattered. The stab-in-the-back myth was a powerful story, but it could not erase the lived experience of the Turnip Winter. The people knew they had been starved, and they would not forget who had failed to protect them. The story of the blockade is the story of an invisible front line, a front that ran not through the mud of Flanders, but through every kitchen in Germany. It was a war fought by housewives and sailors, a silent, grinding conflict whose outcome would shape the destiny of the world. The lesson was learned by all future powers. A nation that cannot feed itself, that cannot fuel its industries from its own resources, is a nation that is fundamentally vulnerable. The pursuit of resource security, of autarky, became a central obsession for aspiring powers in the 20th century, from Nazi Germany to Imperial Japan. The German war machine, the most powerful army in the world, had not been broken. It had starved. It had run out of fuel. It was a magnificent engine that had been deprived of the very resources that gave it life, its power draining away until it simply seized up and fell silent. The world had been shown a new blueprint for victory. The power to control the sea lanes, to grant or deny access to the world's resources, was revealed as the ultimate strategic weapon in an interconnected industrial world. It was a lesson that would define the grand strategy of the great powers for the next century. The final image of the blockade is not one of a sinking ship, but of a German child with the hollow eyes of malnutrition. It is a haunting testament to the terrible, indiscriminate power of this silent weapon, and a reminder that the true cost of war is always paid by the innocent. The German generals, so confident in their land-based power, had been defeated by a simple, inescapable geographical fact. They were a nation with a coastline, facing a nation that was a gatekeeper to the world's oceans. In a long war, geography was destiny. In the end, the German Empire was not conquered. It was suffocated. The Kaiser's generals had laughed at the idea of a naval blockade, dismissing it as a slow, ineffective weapon of a bygone age. They failed to understand that in the grinding industrial marathon of the First World War, it was not the fastest blow that mattered, but the last inexorable squeeze. The silent, invisible noose that had been tightening since 1914 had finally, fatally done its work. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss our next investigation.